The air inside the church was warm with candlelight and soft murmurs. Wooden pews creaked as families settled in, their voices hushed beneath the sound of the gospel, choir's final notes echoing off the high arched ceiling. It was the community's annual Faith in Future evening, a gathering of neighbors, friends, and guests meant to inspire young hearts and remind older ones what mattered most. And seated near the front, framed by the warm glow of stained glass windows, stood Karoline Leavitt. She wore a simple navy blue dress and a soft silver cross around her neck. Her presence was both calm and commanding, not as a politician tonight, but as a guest speaker, someone invited not for her title, but for her values. As she stepped up to the front, past the rows of children and parents, the pastor gave a gentle nod and handed her the microphone. "We asked Miss Leavitt to join us tonight," he said with a kind smile, "because our children deserve to hear from people who lead not just with strength, but with faith." Karoline returned the smile and took a steady breath before speaking. "I'm honored to be here with you all tonight," she said, scanning the room, "especially on an evening meant to remind us that the future isn't just something we plan, it's something we shape with what we believe." She shared a few words about her childhood, her family, and how her faith had carried her through moments of doubt and pressure in Washington. Her voice wasn't rehearsed, it was real. Every sentence wrapped in memory and quiet conviction. When she finished, the pastor stepped forward again and smiled at the children gathered on the front benches. "Now," he said, chuckling, "I promised you all could ask a question, and I see many of you have your hands up." Tiny fingers shot into the air. Karoline laughed softly and pointed to a little boy with glasses who asked about what it was like to be on TV. Another girl wanted to know how many states she had visited. Then the pastor spotted a quiet girl sitting at the end of the second pew, her hands folded in her lap, hesitating. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "would you like to ask something?" The girl looked up, big round eyes and a soft voice. She was no more than 10, wearing a white dress and a pink hairband. Her name was Lily. Karoline turned toward her with a smile, kneeling slightly so they could meet eye to eye. Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think God still listens to little kids, even when big people forget us?" The room went still. No one laughed. No one moved. Karoline's expression changed, not to surprise, but something deeper. Her smile faded into a soft seriousness, and she slowly sat on the edge of the stage so she could speak to Lily without a microphone between them. "I think," Karoline began, her voice suddenly very soft, "that God listens to children even more closely than grown-ups." Lily blinked. "Why?" Karoline looked around the room, then back to her. "Because your voice is pure, because you don't hide what you feel, because when you ask questions like that," she said, her voice catching ever so slightly, "you remind all of us what faith really is." Lily's lips trembled. "But sometimes I pray and I don't feel anything, like I'm talking to a wall." Karoline swallowed. The room behind them was silent. You could hear people breathing. "I've felt that too," Karoline said gently. "I've knelt down, closed my eyes, and wondered if anyone was really listening. But you know what I've learned?" Lily nodded slowly. "God doesn't always answer the way we expect. Sometimes the answer isn't a voice. It's a moment, a stranger being kind, a friend who shows up, a teacher who believes in you. That feeling you get in your heart, that peace, that's Him." Tears had welled up in Lily's eyes. One rolled down her cheek. Karoline reached over and gently wiped it away with her thumb, her own eyes glistening now. "And the fact that you asked that question," she added softly, "means you're already listening better than most grown-ups ever will." A soft sob escaped Lily's lips as she nodded and leaned forward. Not awkwardly, not politely, but with all her heart. She wrapped her arms around Karoline, and Karoline held her close without hesitation. The room remained completely still. Some parents quietly wiped their eyes. The pastor had a hand over his mouth, and Karoline, known in politics for her steel and sharpness, simply cradled a child in her arms, not as a leader, not as a speaker, but as someone who remembered what it felt like to need hope. She whispered into Lily's ear, but no one could hear what she said. Only Lily nodded slowly, her hands clutching Karoline's sleeve. When they finally pulled apart, Lily smiled through her tears and whispered, "Thank you." Karoline brushed a strand of hair behind her ear and said softly, "Thank you for reminding all of us what really matters." The pastor stepped forward quietly. "That," he said, voice trembling just a little, "was more powerful than any sermon I've ever given." The room gave no applause. It didn't need to. The silence was sacred. Karoline stood slowly, turned toward the congregation, and gave a nod. The little silver cross around her neck caught the light just for a second. And in that moment, no one saw a politician. They saw a woman of faith, and a little girl who reminded her why it still matters. Karoline stood silently for a moment after Lily returned to her seat, her eyes scanning the room filled with emotion. People didn't just look at her anymore. They saw her, really saw her, not through the lens of politics or policy, but through something much more powerful: humanity. A few seconds passed before the pastor, his voice thick with emotion, gently stepped up again. He cleared his throat. "I don't think there's anything more we need to hear tonight," he said quietly, placing a hand on Karoline's shoulder. "But if you'd like to say anything else, the floor is still yours." Karoline shook her head softly, still watching Lily, who now leaned gently against her mother's side. "No," she whispered. "I think everything that needed to be said was already said." The crowd stayed seated even as the formal part of the event concluded. There was no rush for the doors, no bustle of chatter. It was as if the entire sanctuary was holding its breath, not wanting to break the reverence that had settled over the room. Karoline took a seat in the front pew, her heart still full. Her hands were clasped gently in her lap, fingers laced around the small silver cross. She didn't notice the woman who sat beside her until she spoke. "I've never seen anyone talk to a child like that," the woman said quietly. She looked to be in her 50s, with a kind, tired smile and soft eyes. "You didn't talk down to her. You just met her right where she was." Karoline turned to her. "That's where the truth lives, right where people are." The woman smiled more deeply. "My son stopped believing in God when he came home from the war. Said if God was real, he wouldn't have let him see what he saw. I tried to talk to him, but I didn't have the words. I think if he'd heard you tonight," her voice trailed off, "he might have listened." Karoline didn't respond right away. She simply placed a gentle hand over the woman's. "Sometimes," she said, "faith doesn't come from answers. It comes from the people who show up." The woman nodded, her eyes glossy. "Thank you for showing up." More people approached quietly as the minutes passed. No one asked about politics. No one brought up polls or parties or headlines. One elderly man shook her hand and said, "You didn't just speak, you listened." "We haven't seen that in a long time." A young mother with a baby on her hip whispered, "My daughter was sitting behind Lily. She told me she wants to talk to God more now, just like her." And finally the pastor returned, now standing beside Karoline as the room began to slowly empty. "Sometimes," he said, folding his arms, "the most powerful moments in a church don't come from behind a pulpit. They come from the pews, from a child asking a question the rest of us were too afraid to say out loud." Karoline gave a small smile. "And from being reminded that faith isn't fragile, it's just quiet." As the evening faded, Karoline slipped outside for air. The night was still and cool, the stars above shining through the branches of the tall oak trees surrounding the church. A few fireflies blinked near the steps. She closed her eyes, letting the breeze wash over her. Behind her, the church doors opened softly. Footsteps approached. Small ones. It was Lily again. She stood there, holding something in her hands. A folded paper. Karoline knelt slightly. "Hey, sweetheart. Everything okay?" Lily nodded and handed her the paper. "I drew this for you." Karoline unfolded it carefully. It was a crayon drawing. Stick figures, yes, but clear. A girl with blonde hair holding hands with a smaller girl, both smiling under a big cross in the sky. Above them were the words, scrawled in careful handwriting, "God hears me." Karoline's breath caught in her throat. Tears welled up again. Not from sorrow, but something far deeper. Something sacred. She looked at Lily, then pulled her into a warm, long hug. "I'm going to keep this forever," she whispered. "Thank you." Lily smiled. wiped her eyes again, and ran back inside. Karoline stood alone for a moment, holding the drawing to her chest. For all the battles she'd fought in her career, for all the debates, the interviews, the criticisms and victories, nothing compared to this. To reminding a child that her voice mattered, to being the answer to someone's unspoken prayer. And in the stillness of that moment, Karoline looked up to the stars, her fingers brushing the silver cross at her neck. "Thank you," she whispered to the sky. And this time, she didn't feel like she was talking to a wall. She felt peace. She felt heard. She felt home. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below.